Do you think that people can change? When I'm feeling good and in more of a positive mood, I'd say yes. People can change. But sometimes when I'm just a little cynical, I might say, well, people is who they is, and they don't change a lot. Do you think people can change? In the Apostle Peter, we have one of the most dramatic examples of a human being changing for the better. It may be the most dramatic example in all of literature, all of human history, of a human being being changed for good. You might not remember about Peter, but Peter, when we first read about him in the Gospels, he means well, but he's so impetuous and he can go so sideways. Do you remember? I mean, it was Peter who at one point was arguing with the disciples about who was the greatest. I mean, he'd been following Jesus. He knew the teachings, the first will be last, the last will be first. He knew about humility, but he had this impulse in him to just try to be the alpha male, and they're arguing about who's the greatest. Do you remember Peter in our Gospels? He means well, but he's the only person that Jesus calls Satan in our Gospel. Do you remember that? At one point, Jesus is trying to explain that his is a path of sacrificial love. He must go and die for us. But then Peter begins to argue with him. And it says Peter rebuked Jesus. The word rebuke in the Greek is a technical term that's used in exorcisms. Peter is literally trying to exorcise Jesus. And then the gospel says that Jesus turned back to Peter and rebuked him using that same technical term. And we have these dueling exorcisms, and then suddenly Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." But Peter could go sideways. Do you remember? When they came to arrest Jesus, and Peter pulls out a sword and cuts off the ear of the servant. I mean, he'd been with Jesus. He knew the sword wasn't Jesus' way. Jesus has him put the sword back. And do you remember that moment Peter displays the most cowardly, unfeeling behavior ever? Do you remember? After Jesus had been arrested, that the slave girl came up and said, "Didn't you know that man?" And Peter says, "I did not know him." And then a second time, another slave girl comes up and says, "We saw you with him." "I did not know him." And then a third time, he's asked, "You were with him." And he starts cursing and calling oaths from God. "I do not know that man." Peter meant well. But he wasn't all together. And then we turn the page. After Easter, we turn to the book of Acts. And Jesus ascends to heaven, and something has happened to Peter. I know we think of the resurrection as this incredible miracle of what happened to Jesus, but it's also an incredible miracle of what happened to Peter. He's a different person. He has changed so much, it's a metamorphosis. Peter in the book of Acts suddenly is standing with a wisdom and power. He's holding forth in public forums with insight and incisive preaching. He begins to perform miracles. Do you remember this? Peter starts healing the paralytics, and he raises someone from the dead. Do you remember this? He is filled with divine power and light. He's exuding this divine light so much that people in the book of Acts are trying to get near him so that even his shadow will fall upon them. Peter, he changed for good. Do you think people can change? I do. Peter's example is so dramatic, we can barely hold on to it, but I think people can change. And sometimes in our lives, it's not that dramatic of a change, but its effects, oh, they're for the good. Psychologists will tell us that it's important for each person to have some moment in their lives where they feel they have been changed for the better. Psychologists call this a redemptive narrative. That every human being should have some story in their own life of when they were changed for the better. They think when a human being has their own redemptive narrative, they'll thrive. They'll continue to grow even more and more. If you can lay claim to a moment in your life when you were changed. Think through your own life right now. Can you lay hold of a moment or a time when you became better? It doesn't have to be that dramatic. I have a redemptive narrative in my head. It's not very dramatic, really. I was just about to finish college, and I had no idea what I was going to do in life. You know that age, you're just finishing college. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but people would ask you, what are you going to go into? And I just would say PR, because no one really knows what that is. I said, yeah, I'm going into PR. I didn't know. I lacked a purpose in life. I was happy. Life was good. I had friends. I was happy. I was waiting tables. I loved waiting tables. But I didn't have a real purpose, and it was right around then I began to have some spiritual experiences of Jesus, and I somehow understood what my purpose was, to follow Him and to help communities follow Him. I suddenly had a mission, and maybe that's not a huge thing, but that feels like my moment where I was changed for the better. I knew what I was going to be and do. Think through your own life. Can you lay claim to a moment that you were changed? It doesn't have to be one moment, some storyline. Do you know the movie Shawshank Redemption? Raise your hand if you've seen Shawshank Redemption. Practically everybody, except some of the young people, I noticed. So that movie came out in 1994, and it was a flop. I mean, it was a big flop. It cost like $25 million to make, and it kind of tanked in the theater. Forrest Gump had just come out, and it was owning everything in the theaters. It wasn't until the next year, 1995, that the Shawshank Redemption became a phenomenon. It had come out on tape. So if you're young here, you're not going to believe this. We used to have machines hooked up to our TV, and you literally, I know you're not going to believe this, you would go to a shop and rent a video, and you would carry it home, and you'd shove it in that machine. And I know you're not going to believe this, but when you finished, you had to return it, but you always returned it late, so they charged you late fees. That's how they made their money. Do you remember the rewind fees? I know it's hard to believe. But anyway, what happened is people started renting that movie, watching it at home, and feeling something. And they began to tell their friends. It was this grassroots, word of mouth. you should watch this movie. And it became what's considered now one of the greatest films of all time. And I think what was touching people so much is it was chock full of redemptive narratives. You can become something better. Do you remember it was a man falsely accused, the Tim Robbins figure, Andy, that's thrown into prison. And there's something special about Andy. He's not really the main redemption story in here because he's already this kind of loving, almost Christ-like figure. The prisoners start to gather around him, and they start sensing some hope because of this man. And do you remember there's a guy named Red in the prison? He had committed murder, and he's a lifer. And Red gets drawn into that light that Andy is exuding, and they start forming a friendship. Red, it was Morgan Freeman. Do you remember Morgan Freeman? Man, I loved him in movies. Wow. It was Morgan Freeman, and throughout this story, you see him starting to get hold of life again and changing inside. There's a moment in this movie where they're sitting there and Andy says, I guess the decision is clear. You either get busy living or you get busy dying. Do you remember that line? You either get busy living or you get busy dying. Now, this is the first time I've ever preached on Shawshank Redemption, which makes me like the only minister in America, because starting in the late 1990s, that film was used in sermons all the time. I've never done it, but Andy ends up escaping from prison. A couple years later, Red comes up from parole, and they ask him if you regret what you did. He said, every day. Every day. And he didn't try to placate the parole committee. He just shared his truth. That he was a better man now. They gave him parole. He went down and found his friend in Mexico. Do you remember that ending? I think that movie touched so many hearts because of a redemption narrative. We can be changed. And sometimes it doesn't have to be something really dramatic. It could be something really small. That if tomorrow, what if tomorrow you just were a little less self-involved? I mean, we're all self-absorbed. It's one of the challenges of being a human being. We get self-centered. We get so within ourselves. We're not really present to others fully if everything's about us. What if tomorrow you just were a little less self-centered in some small way that would accumulate in your life? What if tomorrow you listened to people a little better? You know, listening's not easy. Because when you're listening to someone, you're thinking in your head about your own stuff, and then you're thinking what you're going to say next, and it's not easy to be a good listener. What if tomorrow you really listen to people around you? It's such a gift to people around you. It might be some small thing that begins to accumulate in your life. I know in the Christian faith, we're always saying Jesus saves, and that's awesome. Jesus does save. Your soul is vouchsafed with God through Jesus Christ. Jesus does save. So it sounds like we make the whole faith, though, about that ultimate fate of your soul, and that's great. But we forget that it's not just that Jesus saves. Jesus also improves. I know this sounds like I'm minimizing it. He makes us better. One of the key spiritualities of the church is called the imitation of Christ. We're trying to be a little more Jesus-like this day. And the Apostle Paul talks about taking on the mind of Jesus. We're trying to grow a little bit every day in Christ's likeness. And so you have some impulse in you, and it's beautiful. You came here today because you want to be a little bit better as a person. That is a beautiful impulse. And we know when we gather around Him, you can become a little bit better today. Your soul is vouchsafed by Jesus Christ and God. Jesus saves, but know that He also offers you right now to be changed for good. There's nothing more beautiful than that impulse in you. Keep coming towards Jesus.